Most people think making money online is simple. Get attention, sell something, make profit. That's what they tell you. That's what the courses say. That's what the gurus repeat. But if it were that simple, why do most people with attention stay broke? Why do some creators get millions of views and still struggle? And why do a very small group of people quietly build machines that print money without ever looking like they're selling anything? There's a gap here, a massive one. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because the truth is, attention doesn't make money. Structure does. And most people don't have one. Let me show you something most people miss. There are two types of players in the game. The first group chases views. They post. They go viral sometimes. They celebrate numbers. But behind the scenes, no system, no conversion path, no long-term leverage. They're renting attention, and rented attention is the most unstable asset you can build on. The second group, they don't chase attention. They capture it. And more importantly, they control where it goes next. This is where everything changes. Because once attention enters a control system, it stops being random. It becomes predictable. It becomes scalable. It becomes monetizable. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The smartest operators don't try to make money immediately. They delay it on purpose. Think about that. In a world where everyone is desperate to sell something quickly, the real players slow down. They give more. They educate more. They build trust first. Why? Because they understand something most people don't. The longer you delay monetization strategically, the higher the value of the customer becomes. So instead of asking, how do I make money from this view? They ask, how do I turn this stranger into someone who never leaves my ecosystem? That's a completely different game. Now imagine this. A stranger sees your content. That's step one. Simple enough, but instead of trying to sell them immediately, you guide them somewhere. A softer entry point. Maybe it's a free email list. Maybe it's a piece of content. Maybe it's a simple low commitment offer. Not to make money, but to capture identity, to turn an anonymous viewer into a known person. Because anonymous attention is useless. But identified attention, that's power. Now you know who they are. Or you can reach them again. You can build a relationship. You can move them step by step. And this is where most people fail. They try to jump from stranger to sale immediately. No bridge, no trust, no system. But high-level operators, they build layers. Layer one, free value, content, education, insights. This is where trust is built. Not by talking about yourself, but by solving problems for free. Better than most people solve them for money. That's important. Because if your free content isn't better than someone else's paid content, you've already lost. Now, once trust is built, you introduce the next layer. Layer two, low friction commitment. This could be a book, a small purchase, a membership, something simple, not expensive, not complicated, but meaningful. Why? Because when someone pays, even a small amount, their psychology changes. They stop being a passive consumer and become an active participant. And that shift is everything. Now you have something even more valuable than attention. You have buying behavior. From here, the system evolves. Because now you can ask a different question. Who are the people that want more? Not everyone will. And that's fine. Because you don't need everyone. You only need the ones who are ready to go deeper. This is where the third layer comes in. Layer three, high-value transformation. This is where real money is made. Not from the masses, but from the few. The people who want faster results, want personalized help, want proximity. And here's the key. These people were never strangers. They were built. through the system. They started with free content. They moved to small commitments. They built trust over time. And by the time they reach this level, they're already convinced. No chasing, no convincing, no pressure, just alignment. This is why some businesses can charge thousands, even tens of thousands, without resistance. Because the sale didn't happen at the offer. It happened in the journey. Now pause for a second and think about what this really means. Most people are trying to make money at the end, but the real money is made at the beginning in how you design the path. Because once the path is built correctly, everything else becomes automatic. And this is where things start to compound. Because now, you don't just have customers, you have a system that attracts attention, captures attention, nurtures attention, monetizes attention, and then recycles it. Yes, recycles it. Because the smartest operators don't just make money, they reinvest it back into the system. More content, better distribution, stronger infrastructure, which brings in more attention, which feeds the system again. This is what people mean when they talk about a flywheel. But most people misunderstand it. A flywheel is not just growth. It's self-reinforcing momentum. Once it starts spinning, it gets easier, faster, stronger, and eventually, it becomes very hard to stop. But here's the part nobody talks about. At a certain point, the system stops being about money. It becomes about control. Control over audience distribution opportunities, and most importantly, decisions. Because when you control attention, you don't just sell products, you create options. And this is where the game changes completely. Because now, you're not just making money from customers. You're making money from partnerships, investments, assets, opportunities that didn't exist before. And this is where most people never reach because they're too focused on short-term sales to ever build long-term leverage. But the few who understand this play a different game entirely. They don't build businesses. They build ecosystems where everything connects, everything feeds everything, and nothing is wasted. Attention becomes customers. Customers become capital. Capital becomes assets. Assets create more leverage. Leverage brings more attention, and the cycle continues. Now, here's the question you should be asking yourself. If this is how the game is really played, why isn't everyone doing it? Because it requires something most people don't have: patience. And more importantly, clarity. Because to build a system like this, you need to think beyond today, beyond the next sale, beyond the next post. You need to think in systems. And that's rare. In part 2, I'm going to show you something even deeper. How this system expands into real estate venture investments, private equity, and why the smartest operators don't just sell, they own. Because once you understand that part, you'll realize this was never about content. It was about building a machine that turns attention into long-term power. Eerie, where the real money actually goes. By the time most people think the game is over, the real game is just beginning. Because the smartest operators don't stop at making money. They redirect it. Everything you saw in part 1, the content, the conversions, the high-ticket offers, that's just the front end, the visible part, the part everyone copies. But the back end, that's where the advantage lives. Once cash starts flowing in, it doesn't sit idle. It gets deployed strategically into assets that grow independently of attention. First, real estate. Not for status, not for vanity, but for stability and tax efficiency. It's predictable. It produces cash flow. It protects wealth. So while the front-end business brings in volatile income, real estate anchors it. Second, venture bets. Small, well-calculated investments in companies with massive upside. Some will fail, but one win can outperform everything else. And here's the hidden edge. These aren't random bets. They're placed inside an ecosystem where distribution already exists. That means instead of building from zero, these ventures plug into attention that's already captured. They grow faster, cheaper, smarter. Third, ownership. This is where the game shifts completely. Instead of just serving businesses, you start buying into them, sometimes partially, sometimes fully. Why? Because if you already understand how to grow a business and you already have the audience to support it, owning equity becomes the most logical move. Now you're no longer trading time or services for money. You're building long-term positions, assets that can be scaled, sold, or leveraged. And then comes the final layer, the ecosystem expansion, new services, new tools, new infrastructure, all designed to serve the same audience, but at different stages: insurance, financing, technology, communities. Each one adds value. Each one creates another entry point, and each one increases retention. At this stage, people don't just buy once. They stay. They grow inside the system. They reinvest back into it. And that's the ultimate goal. Not just customers, but lifetime participants. So the model evolves into something much bigger. Attention to trust, to transactions, to assets, to ownership, to expansion. And once it's fully built, it becomes very hard to compete with because you're no longer just a business. You're a network, a platform, an environment people don't want to leave. And that's the real secret. It was never about making money from attention. It was about using attention to build something that makes money without needing attention forever. That's how a simple content strategy turns into a $250 million plus machine, not by selling more, but by owning more.